What would you do if your in-laws believed they could run your life better than you could, and decided to take over completely? For me, it started with helpful visits and ended in chaos, police lights, and locked doors. It was September 2023 when things began unraveling. My wife, Sophie, and I were living a peaceful life, or at least trying to, in Fort Collins, Colorado. Our modest home, nestled in a suburban neighborhood with its ever-present HOA, was where we were raising our spirited 2-year-old daughter, Ella. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Enter Laura and Frederick Harrison, my in-laws. Laura, the self-proclaimed matriarch of perfection, and Frederick, her quieter but complicit partner. From the moment Sophie married me, Laura had made her disapproval crystal clear. In her eyes, I was a simple man from a working-class background who had somehow stolen her daughter's potential. But the real drama began when Sophie got her dream job offer, a 6-month project in Munich, Germany. It was a career-defining opportunity, and while I was incredibly proud of her, Laura saw it as a direct attack on her control. "You're seriously leaving Ella behind for 6 months?" Laura had exclaimed, her voice dripping with judgment. "What kind of mother abandons her child for a job?" Sophie's calm response only seemed to add fuel to the fire. "James will take care of Ella. He's fully capable." Laura's piercing glare shifted to me, and I could almost hear her inner monologue screaming, "Capable? Him?" I assured Sophie we would manage, but as she packed for Munich, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Laura wouldn't let this go. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the nightmare Laura was about to unleash on us. The day Sophie left for Munich was bittersweet. Ella and I waved goodbye at the airport, her tiny hand clutching mine as Sophie disappeared past security. I promised her that we'd be fine, but as I drove home, a sense of foreboding settled over me. It didn't take long for Laura to make her presence known. 3 days after Sophie's departure, she showed up unannounced at my front door. I opened it to find her standing there, holding 2 large bags of groceries like some kind of uninvited savior. "Oh, James, I brought you and Ella some essentials," she said, brushing past me into the house before I could respond. "I know Sophie's absence must be overwhelming for you." Her tone dripped with condescension. She bustled into the kitchen and began unpacking the bags, organic vegetables, gluten-free snacks, and jars of baby food Ella wouldn't touch. "Laura," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady, "I appreciate the thought, but we're fine. We don't need help." "Nonsense," she shot back, waving a hand dismissively. "Ella needs proper nutrition, and I can't imagine what you're feeding her with Sophie gone. Honestly, James, you shouldn't have to do this alone." Her gaze lingered on me, sharp and scrutinizing. It was as if she were waiting for me to crack, to admit I couldn't handle it. Instead, I stood my ground. "Ella and I are managing just fine," I said, my tone unwavering. "We have a routine, and everything is under control." Laura's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she changed tactics. "You know, Frederick and I were talking, and we think it would be best if Ella stayed with us while Sophie is away. It would give you some breathing room, and we could ensure she's cared for properly." My jaw tightened. Absolutely not. Ella is staying here, in her home, with me. This is what Sophie and I decided, and we're not changing our minds. Laura didn't press further that day, but her expression spoke volumes. As she left, she gave me a saccharine smile and said, "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find us." The next few weeks were a constant battle of boundaries. Laura began dropping by more frequently, always under the guise of helping. One afternoon, she arrived with Frederick in tow. "We were in the neighborhood," she said sweetly, though I doubted the truth of that. "We thought we'd take Ella to the park for a bit." Without waiting for my agreement, she bent down to scoop Ella up, but I stepped between them. "Laura, you need to stop," I said, my voice firm. You can't just show up and decide what's best for Ella. I'm her father, and I know what I'm doing. Frederick, usually silent, chimed in, his tone scolding. We're only trying to help, James. You should be grateful. Grateful? I shot back, my patience wearing thin. Grateful for you undermining me at every turn? This stops now. Respect our boundaries or don't come back. They left after that, but I knew this wasn't over. Laura didn't take kindly to being told no, and I could feel her scheming from miles away. Little did I know, her helpful visits were just the beginning of something far more sinister. The first sign that Laura's meddling was escalating came in the form of a neatly folded letter in my mailbox, a warning from the HOA. It listed a series of minor violations: overgrown grass, toys left in the front yard, and my trash can being placed too close to the curb. Each offense seemed trivial, almost laughable, but the penalties were real, escalating fines and the threat of further action if I didn't comply. I called the HOA office, irritated but polite. There must be some mistake, I said. These infractions are exaggerated at best. I've never even received complaints about this before. The woman on the phone hesitated. We've been getting anonymous reports, she finally admitted. I didn't need 3 guesses to figure out who was behind them. Laura's fingerprints were all over this. The next morning, she confirmed my suspicions with an uninvited appearance. As usual, she breezed through the door as though it were her own, carrying a clipboard this time. Oh, James, she began with mock concern, I couldn't help but notice your yard has been looking neglected. You know the HOA takes that sort of thing very seriously. Seriously enough to send me a warning letter? I shot back, crossing my arms. Laura raised her eyebrows, feigning innocence. I only mentioned it to Karen the other day. It's her job to uphold standards, after all. Honestly, James, if you'd just let Frederick and me help out more, this wouldn't even be an issue. Her tone was as sweet as sugar, but the implied threat was sharp as a knife. As the weeks passed, her interference grew bolder. One afternoon, I hired a babysitter, Maggie, to watch Ella while I tackled a work deadline. Halfway through the afternoon, I heard voices downstairs, Laura's unmistakable cadence cutting through the air like a knife. When I rushed down, I found her and Frederick sitting comfortably in my living room, playing with Ella. Maggie was nowhere in sight. What's going on here? I demanded, my frustration barely contained. Where's Maggie? Oh, we sent her home, Laura said casually, not even glancing up. There's no need to pay a stranger when family is here. You had no right to do that, I snapped, my voice rising. I hired her because I have work to do. You can't just show up and dismiss the babysitter I arranged for. Frederick leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. Now, James, calm down. We're just trying to help. There's no need to make a scene. A scene? I said, my anger boiling over. This isn't helping, it's interference. You're overstepping, and I'm done with it. I called Maggie to apologize, but the damage was done. Laura and Frederick had crossed a line, and it was clear they had no intention of stopping. That evening, I called Sophie to fill her in. She was furious. That's it, she said. I'm calling them right now. This has gone too far. No, I said quickly. I'll handle it. They won't take me seriously if you step in. I need to show them I can do this on my own. In hindsight, I should have let Sophie take charge. Maybe things wouldn't have spiraled the way they did. But at the time, I was determined to stand my ground. What I didn't know was that Laura wasn't just meddling anymore, she was planning. And her next move would shatter any semblance of control I thought I had. The call came from Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor. Her voice was tinged with concern as she said, James, is everything all right? I saw Laura and Frederick at your house earlier today with some men who looked like locksmiths. My stomach dropped. Locksmiths? I repeated, gripping the phone tightly. What time was this? Around noon, she replied. I thought you might have hired them, but when I saw Laura handing over what looked like papers, I got worried. I barely thanked her before hanging up and racing home. Dread coiled in my stomach as I pulled into the driveway, and the sight before me made my blood run cold. The locks on the front door had been changed. Inside, I could see Laura and Frederick through the window, sitting in my living room with cups of tea as though they owned the place. Without thinking, I pounded on the door. Laura appeared a moment later, opening it just enough to smirk at me. "Oh, James," she said sweetly, "can I help you?" "Let me in," I growled, barely able to contain my rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Frederick appeared behind her, calm and smug. "This isn't your house anymore," he said, holding up a stack of papers. "We've taken custody of Ella and legal possession of the property. It's for the best, really." My jaw dropped. "What? That's insane. You can't just take my house and my daughter." Laura's expression remained unbothered. "We can, actually," she said, waving the papers in my face. "We have legal documents proving everything. You really should be more careful about where you leave your financial paperwork, James." My mind reeled. What paperwork? What were they even talking about? "Where's Ella?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Let me see her." "She's upstairs napping," Frederick said dismissively. "Now, I suggest you leave before we're forced to call the police." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Gripping my phone, I snapped, "Oh, I'm calling the police, all right, on you." Laura's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "Go ahead," she said. "We have the law on our side. You'll only embarrass yourself." I stepped back, dialing with trembling fingers. As the line connected, I explained the situation as best I could, my heart racing. Then, I called Sophie. "What's wrong?" she answered immediately, her voice panicked. I struggled to find the words, my anger and fear colliding. They've taken the house. They claim they have custody of Ella. Sophie, they changed the locks." The silence on the other end was deafening, but then Sophie said, "I'm coming home. I'll book the next flight. Don't do anything rash, James. Wait for the police. I'll be there as soon as I can." The next few hours were a blur. When the police arrived, I explained the situation while Laura and Frederick presented their legal documents. The officers quickly saw through the crude forgeries, but the damage had already been done. Ella, confused and crying, was brought downstairs by an officer. Seeing her tiny face stained with tears shattered what little resolve I had left. The police took Laura and Frederick to the station for questioning, but I wasn't allowed to stay in the house until ownership could be confirmed. Ella was placed in temporary custody with child services, a precaution until the situation was fully sorted. As I gathered a few belongings and left the house that night, my heart felt heavier than it ever had. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a complete betrayal. And I knew that our lives would never be the same again. The first night away from home felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I stayed with my parents in a small guest room that barely fit Ella's travel crib. She clung to me, her small hands gripping my shirt, as if afraid I might disappear too. Her sobs had quieted, but her wide, tear-streaked eyes told me everything. She was scared, confused, and exhausted. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Laura's smug smile haunted me. The memory of Frederick's dismissive tone echoed in my mind. They actually believed they were justified in taking my daughter and my home. How did it come to this? The next morning, Sophie called. Her voice was filled with guilt and urgency. "James, I'm on my way back. I'll land tomorrow morning. I should have known they'd pull something like this. It's not your fault, I replied, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. They've been planning this for months, Sophie. The forged papers, the locks. They must have intercepted our mail somehow. They knew exactly what they were doing. As Sophie's flight made its way back to the States, the investigation into Laura and Frederick's actions began to uncover the depths of their deception. The forged custody documents claimed Sophie had granted them full guardianship of Ella, citing her absence and my supposed inability to care for her. They even had fake mortgage papers claiming they had purchased the house. I was stunned when the police informed me they'd likely bribed our mail carrier to gain access to our financial documents. Laura's obsession with control wasn't just invasive, it was criminal. Over the next few days, I worked closely with a lawyer to untangle the mess. Every conversation felt like reliving the nightmare. The lawyer explained, it's a solid forgery, but they slipped up in a few areas. Their scheme relies on you not fighting back. Once we present the truth, the law will be on your side. Despite that reassurance, the emotional toll was devastating. Ella refused to sleep alone. She woke up crying in the middle of the night, calling for Sophie. I tried my best to comfort her, but the weight of the situation crushed me. Sophie arrived home the next morning, rushing into my arms. We both held Ella tightly, as if by holding her, we could somehow undo the trauma Laura and Frederick had inflicted. They've destroyed everything, Sophie said, her voice breaking. How could they do this? To Ella? To us? They convinced themselves they were saving her, I replied bitterly. But this wasn't about Ella. This was about power. About control. They couldn't stand that we didn't need them. As the days turned into weeks, the legal battle began to take shape. The police charged Laura and Frederick with multiple felonies, including fraud, forgery, and trespassing. They were released on bail, but a restraining order kept them from coming near us or Ella. Though we were making progress legally, the emotional scars were harder to heal. Ella had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming for us. Sophie threw herself into preparing our case, but I could see the guilt eating away at her. I tried to stay strong for them, but every time I passed our old neighborhood or saw an unfamiliar car parked nearby, paranoia crept in. It wasn't just about getting our home back, it was about reclaiming the safety and peace of mind they had stolen from us. Little did we know, the battle ahead would test us in ways we couldn't imagine. The fight for justice was far from over, but one thing was certain, we wouldn't let Laura and Frederick win. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of court filings, depositions, and sleepless nights. Sophie and I devoted every ounce of energy we had to fighting back against Laura and Frederick's outrageous scheme. Our lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Rachel, quickly dismantled the web of lies they had spun. Their forgery was amateur at best, Rachel explained during one meeting, tapping her pen against the stack of fake documents. They made errors in dates, signatures, and even the notary stamps. This isn't just fraud, it's desperation. Despite Rachel's confidence, the emotional toll was immense. Each court hearing was a brutal reminder of how deeply Laura and Frederick had betrayed us. Sophie struggled with the weight of her parents' actions, often breaking down after long days in court. I don't understand how they could do this to us, she said one night, tears streaming down her face. To Ella. They were supposed to love and protect her. I think, in their own twisted way, they believed they were, I replied. But this was never about Ella. It was about control. About proving they could take over our lives if we didn't live up to their expectations. The turning point came during the trial when the extent of their deceit was laid bare. Evidence showed that Laura had bribed our mail carrier to intercept financial documents, giving them access to mortgage papers and personal records. The courtroom was tense as our lawyer presented undeniable proof of their crimes. When Laura took the stand, she tried to justify her actions. We only wanted what was best for Ella, she claimed, her voice trembling with false sincerity. James was struggling, and Sophie was gone. Someone had to step in. Rachel didn't let her off the hook. So you believed that forging legal documents, trespassing, and kidnapping your own granddaughter were acceptable ways to step in? Laura faltered, her composure cracking. Frederick, on the other hand, remained stoic, saying little and leaving the brunt of the defense to his wife. The verdict was swift and decisive. Laura and Frederick were found guilty of multiple charges, including fraud, forgery, and trespassing. Each was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. When the judge read the sentence, I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. Instead, there was a deep sadness, for Sophie, who had to endure the betrayal of her parents, for Ella, who would grow up knowing the lengths her grandparents went to for control, and even for Laura and Frederick, whose misguided arrogance had led them to ruin. With the legal battle behind us, Sophie and I made the difficult decision to sell the house. Every corner of it was tainted with memories of the ordeal. We needed a fresh start, far from Fort Collins and the toxic reach of Laura and Frederick. We found a quiet home in Salt Lake City, Utah, nestled in a friendly neighborhood without an HOA. Moving was bittersweet. Leaving behind the house where we had built so many memories was hard, but the promise of peace and a new beginning outweighed the pain. Ella, resilient as ever, began to thrive in her new environment. Sophie returned to work, and I started a small home business that allowed me to be there for Ella. Slowly, we rebuilt our lives, focusing on what truly mattered, our family. Though the scars from Laura and Frederick's betrayal remained, we vowed to move forward. They had tried to tear us apart, but instead, their actions had strengthened our bond. As I stood on the porch of our new home one evening, watching Ella chase bubbles in the yard, I realized something profound. We had been through hell, but we had survived. Together. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them the same way, as a family. It's been a year since the courtroom drama ended, and life has slowly started to feel normal again. Well, a new kind of normal. Sophie, Ella, and I have built a quiet life in Salt Lake City, far from the chaos and control that once loomed over us. Our new neighborhood is everything we hoped for, friendly, peaceful, and, best of all, free of an HOA. Ella, now 3 years old, is thriving in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. She giggles freely, runs through our backyard with boundless energy, and talks non-stop about her favorite cartoons. It's a relief to see her so carefree, though Sophie and I still notice the occasional lingering effects of the ordeal. At times, Ella will wake up from a bad dream, clutching her blanket and asking if Grandma and Grandpa are coming back. It breaks our hearts every time, but we reassure her that she's safe, always. Sophie has thrown herself back into her career, now working remotely for the company that sent her to Munich. She's thriving professionally, but I know the weight of her parents' betrayal still lingers. On more than one occasion, I've caught her staring at old family photos, her expression a mix of sadness and frustration. "I just don't understand how they could do it," she said one night, breaking the silence as we sat on the porch. "They were supposed to love Ella, not use her." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. People like Laura and Frederick don't know how to love without control. They thought they were saving Ella, but it was never about her. It was about them. Sophie nodded but didn't respond. Some wounds take longer to heal. The legal scars are still present, too. Despite their convictions, Laura and Frederick have appealed the case twice, though neither attempt has gained traction. They're serving their time in a Colorado state prison, and as part of their sentencing, they're prohibited from contacting us. While the restraining order offers some comfort, I'd be lying if I said I didn't occasionally glance over my shoulder, half expecting their shadow to reappear. But amidst the emotional debris, there's been growth. Sophie and I have found strength in each other, our bond more solid than ever. The challenges we faced forced us to communicate in ways we hadn't before, and together, we've prioritized rebuilding a sense of trust and stability for Ella. Financially, we've recovered, though the move and legal fees took a significant toll. My home business, a small graphic design firm, has picked up, giving me the flexibility to balance work and parenting. Sophie's remote role has been a blessing, allowing her to focus on her career while spending time with Ella. Most importantly, we've created new traditions as a family. Saturday pancake breakfasts, movie nights on the couch, and Sunday hikes in the nearby canyons have become staples of our routine. These simple moments remind us of what truly matters, the love and safety we've worked so hard to protect. Looking back, I'm struck by how far we've come. There are still days when the memories of that time creep in, when an unexpected knock at the door makes my chest tighten, or when Ella asks a question that brings back painful reminders. But those moments are fewer now, overshadowed by the joy of watching our daughter grow and thrive. As we move forward, one thing is clear: we're not the same people we were a year ago. We're stronger, closer, and more grateful for the peace we've found. And while Laura and Frederick's actions left scars, they also taught us an invaluable lesson: family isn't defined by blood but by love, respect, and the boundaries we set to protect one another. Our story is far from over, but for now, we're focused on what lies ahead, embracing the quiet beauty of our new life together. 2 years after we'd closed the chapter on Laura and Frederick, an unexpected letter arrived. It was addressed to Sophie, postmarked from Colorado State Prison. She opened it hesitantly, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. As I watched her face shift from apprehension to shock, I knew it wasn't just another bureaucratic update. "It's from my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The letter was unlike anything we'd expected. Laura apologized, genuinely apologized. She didn't justify her actions or try to downplay them. Instead, she wrote about how prison had forced her to confront her choices, to see the harm she'd caused not just to Sophie and me, but to Ella. She admitted that her need for control had blinded her to what truly mattered: the happiness and safety of her family. Frederick had also been attending therapy, she wrote, and together, they were working to understand the depths of their mistakes. Laura ended the letter with a plea, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to make amends. Sophie was silent for a long time after reading it. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do we do with this?" We spent weeks discussing it. Part of me wanted to burn the letter and forget it ever arrived, to shield our family from any further pain. But another part, one I didn't like admitting, saw the sincerity in Laura's words and wondered if there was room for healing, not just for Sophie, but for Ella. Eventually, we agreed to meet them, but only under strict conditions. The first meeting would be held in a neutral location, with a family therapist present. This wasn't about reconciliation yet, it was about setting boundaries and gauging their sincerity. The day of the meeting, Sophie and I were a bundle of nerves. As we entered the therapist's office, I caught sight of Laura and Frederick sitting side by side. They looked older, smaller, as though the weight of their choices had physically diminished them. Laura's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Frederick's usually stoic expression was replaced by something softer: regret, perhaps. The session was intense. Laura spoke first, her voice shaking as she acknowledged the pain she'd caused. She didn't offer excuses, only explanations. "I thought I was protecting Ella," she said. "But I see now that it was never about her. It was about me. My pride. My need to control. And I'm so sorry for what I've done." Frederick followed, his voice steady but no less emotional. "I supported Laura because I thought we were doing the right thing. I see now that we were wrong. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, if you'll let me." Sophie cried through most of the session. I stayed quiet, my arms crossed, unsure if I could let my guard down. The therapist guided the conversation, helping us navigate the raw emotions that had been buried for years. When the session ended, we didn't walk out as a reconciled family, but we left with the smallest glimmer of hope. We agreed to continue meeting, with the therapist present, to take things one step at a time. Over the next year, those meetings became a regular occurrence. At first, they were painfully awkward, filled with long silences and tentative words. But slowly, something shifted. Laura and Frederick showed genuine change, not just in their words, but in their actions. They respected every boundary we set, never pushing for more than we were willing to give. The first time Ella saw them again, it was under careful supervision. We explained, in terms she could understand, why she hadn't seen her grandparents in so long. She was hesitant at first, hiding behind me as Laura knelt to her level, tears streaming down her face. "I missed you so much, Ella," Laura said softly. "And I'm so sorry I hurt you and your family." By the end of that visit, Ella was laughing at Frederick's silly jokes and looking through old photo albums Laura had brought. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Rebuilding trust has been a slow, painful process. There are still moments of doubt, still wounds that haven't fully healed. But for the first time, it feels like we're moving forward, not as the family we were, but as the family we're trying to become. It had been nearly 6 months since we'd cautiously allowed Laura and Frederick back into our lives. The meetings, supervised visits, and therapy sessions were progressing better than I'd dared to hope. They seemed genuine in their efforts to rebuild trust, and though the wounds they inflicted on our family would never fully heal, we had begun to find a fragile sense of peace. Then, one day, Laura and Frederick approached us with an unexpected proposal. It was during one of our now regular visits at the therapist's office. Laura, visibly nervous, clutched a folder tightly in her hands. Frederick sat beside her, his face unusually solemn. "We've been thinking about how we can truly make amends," Laura began, her voice trembling. "And we know words aren't enough. Actions speak louder." Sophie and I exchanged wary glances. Over the past few months, we'd learned to tread cautiously with Laura and Frederick, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Frederick leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "We found out that the house we lived in before everything fell apart, is being auctioned off by the state. We've saved every penny we've earned since we were released. It's not much, but it's enough to buy it back." I felt my stomach tighten. I couldn't imagine why they were telling us this. "We want to buy it," Laura continued, her eyes welling with tears. "Not for us, but for Ella. For her future. We'd like to set it up as a trust, something she can use when she's older. For college, a home, whatever she needs. It's not enough to erase what we did, but it's something. It's a start." The room fell silent. Sophie and I sat frozen, processing what they were offering. My mind immediately swirled with questions. Was this just another attempt at control? Some elaborate way to buy their way back into our lives? Our therapist broke the silence first. "That's a very generous offer," she said carefully. "But James and Sophie, it's up to you to decide what you feel comfortable with." Sophie looked at me, her eyes filled with the same mix of doubt and cautious hope I felt. We asked for time to think, and over the following weeks, we agonized over the decision. The gesture was undeniably generous, but it came with complexities. Would accepting it tie us to them in ways we didn't want? Was it possible they were using this as a way to manipulate us? Or was this, perhaps, the real sign of change we'd been waiting for? After consulting with our lawyer and therapist, we reached a compromise. We agreed to allow them to buy the house, but instead of giving it directly to Ella, we insisted that the funds be placed in a trust controlled by an independent third party. This way, the money would genuinely benefit Ella, and Laura and Frederick would have no control over how it was used. When we presented our conditions, they didn't hesitate. "We'll do whatever it takes," Frederick said. "This isn't about us. It's about her." The process took several months to finalize, but when it was done, the trust was ironclad. The house was sold, and the proceeds were securely allocated for Ella's future. The day the papers were signed, Laura handed us the final documents with tears streaming down her face. "We know this doesn't make up for everything," she said softly. "But we hope it's a step in the right direction." For the first time, I believed her. While the gesture didn't erase the past, it marked a turning point. It showed us that they weren't just saying the right things, they were willing to take meaningful action. For Sophie and me, it wasn't just about the money or the trust. It was about knowing that, for once, Laura and Frederick were putting Ella's needs above their own. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. And in a family that had been broken so badly, even the smallest steps toward healing felt monumental. 5 years have passed since Laura and Frederick's betrayal turned our lives upside down. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain, and while we'll never forget what happened, we've come to terms with it. Ella is now 8, a bright and curious child with an infectious laugh that fills our home. Sophie and I are closer than ever, our bond forged in the fire of everything we endured. We've maintained a cautious but steady relationship with Laura and Frederick. Their visits remain infrequent and carefully managed, but Ella has started to see them as her grandparents again, a reality I never thought possible. Their actions over the years have proven that they are genuinely trying to change. And for the most part, it feels like the worst is behind us. Or so we thought. Last week, an envelope arrived at our doorstep. It was addressed to Sophie, the handwriting unfamiliar. When she opened it, a single piece of paper fell out, along with a photo that made my blood run cold. It was an old picture of Laura and Frederick standing in front of a massive estate, a house we didn't recognize. Scribbled on the back of the photo were the words, "Not everything was as it seemed." The letter itself was short, cryptic, and unsigned. It read, "You don't know the whole story. There are things you were never told, things you need to uncover." Laura and Frederick's betrayal was just the beginning. Sophie and I sat in stunned silence, staring at the photo and the letter. Who could have sent this? And what did it mean? We thought we knew everything, but now doubt has crept back in like an unwelcome guest. For now, we've decided not to confront Laura and Frederick. If there are more secrets to uncover, we'll need to tread carefully. But one thing is certain. Just when we thought the past was behind us, it seems we've only scratched the surface of the truth. Our story isn't over, and it feels like a new chapter is just beginning. What would you do if you found yourself in our situation? Would you confront Laura and Frederick or try to move on without digging deeper? Have you ever faced betrayal from those you thought you could trust? Or dealt with family members who crossed every boundary imaginable? Share your experiences in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your own tales of family drama below. You never know who might relate to your story.